The time is coming, make no mistake. The time of the assassins. The time of resistance and great social unrest. All that has happened up until this point is a fake. A sham in order to place more power and assets into the hands of the oligarchies, the 1%. Like it or not, there is a war coming. There are forces moving into position. Only time will tell who shall rise victorious. But I'll tell you this world will not be the same as it was. Chances are, you knew this already. Young Ramla talked in her sleep. The wind outside caused twigs to clatter against the small stained glass window. The rain was heavy, and the night was cold and brash. Incoherent words and phrases issued from Ramla's lips. Even the wind outside was not bold enough or brash enough to overrule her strange, somnolent chanting. At 13, Ramla was certainly the youngest in her group. She was definitely the most gifted. She was gifted in as much as she possessed quite a powerful mind. Being a level 5 telepath meant that she could read other people's thoughts with an alarming dexterity. She shared a dormitory with 4 of her colleagues. It was like a tiny convent room and was sparsely furnished. The whitewashed walls were bare except for the solitary crucifix that hung over Ramla's wooden bedpost. A French window giving onto the gardens beyond revealed dark silhouettes on the west wall, like fingers stretching, scratching eerily, thin as sticks. She lay without any covers. The sheets had been cast off with a single reflex of restless vexation. She felt neither the cold nor the soft material upon her skin. It was late. The clock in the hallway outside her room chimed midnight. Usually Ramla could shield her mind from other telepaths, especially the more dangerous ones. She had that astonishing ability, but even she wasn't infallible. The tiny clock, which was perched at her bedside, persisted with its faint but audible tick. It had just gone 12 midnight. Everything had been quiet up until that time. Suddenly her eyes began to move rapidly under her lids, a condition known as REM sleep. She began to mouth words that were not even audible. Her limbs twitched with small spasms. Quickly, she sensed a stranger's approach. A powerful mind, yes. A mind more powerful than even hers. But who? Friend or foe? She felt the stranger's words whispering in her head.
but there was no profile to fit the words. Whoever it was, this outsider who had intruded on her thoughts, his face was blocked from Ramla's mind. Nothing but the voice could get through, making the girl squirm and toss restlessly. This invader was like nothing she had ever faced. Ramla had sensed by some means of empathy a hint of anger and resentment, deeply seated within the invader's mind. Ramla could only scratch the surface, sensing these feelings, though not the reason or reasons behind the feelings that were being disclosed to her. There was just too much history there for her to get a full picture. Where was the intruder? He was definitely close. That was fairly obvious. But was the intruder inside the Institute? No, that would be impossible. The place had been locked up tight, with all its security systems in place. Was the intruder outside the window? Or in the street? No? Where then? Where else but in little Ramla's mind? She tried to reach out to the person with her own thoughts. She probed deep, though the faceless one would have none of it. The intruder kept driving her back. Every time Ramla came near, the faceless one would block her. Ramla flinched under its weight. Like a vast and dark cloak, it came down over her to suffocate and stifle. In a single blink, the world around Ramla had disappeared into pitch darkness. She scratched at the bedsheets with her long nails, trying desperately to get away, to no avail. This new mind, deluded, threatening, which saturated her thoughts with a terrible sense of hopelessness, had completely swathed her mind in its own terrible insights. She uttered one lucid word. No! The sequence of images and thoughts increased, muscling in, imposing on her sleep, toppling every barrier she had erected to protect her own powerful, though fragile young mind. With a violent and sudden movement, she woke. Her eyes shot open. An audible breath escaped her lips. Quickly she rose from her bed, making a conscious effort, and began to hurry towards the bedroom door. She reached out to grasp the handle. She was still frantic, caught midway between this waking reality and her monstrous dreams. She swung the door wide. Beyond it, she saw a much different scene to the one she had expected to find. Beyond the door, it all looked different. A long corridor stretched out before her, a corridor with high walls marked in hieroglyphs, the writing of her very ancestors, it seemed. She drew in a breath, stopping in her tracks. The corridor itself appeared to be part of an ancient temple, one that might have been dedicated to the great powerful gods of old, or perhaps to the cherished kings or mighty pharaohs. She proceeded, stepping forth into the shimmering torchlight. Her bare feet made their small pitter-pattering sound on the stone as she advanced cautiously. The torches had been lit outside the door, the roaring fires that curled and licked upwards inside giant braziers made a soft, almost lulling sound in her ears, though the terrible feeling of apprehension and fear still encompassed her rattled heart. Leaving the door open behind her, she continued to tread. Her eyes, wide as apertures, moved back and forth along the walls. From the tallest pillar to the smallest statue, everything was gold and burnished. Colonnades and braziers stretched across the room, to be met only a few kilometers away by an open courtyard. As she moved further, the sounds of running water began to fill her ears. Squawking birds made up a sharp cacophony of sound, making her senses reel. She shuddered as she turned her head this way and then that, trying to see where the sounds were coming from. Her eyes displayed fear that increased with each step. Perhaps there was an aviary nearby. She could not see anything, though the birds were loud and their song was strident enough to make the hair stand up on the back of her neck. She stepped gingerly into the light. The fullness of the sun greeted her as she approached the open courtyard. The heat of the stone felt unbearable under her bare feet. She could not walk any further. The sound of the birds flocking nearby continued. Their terrible screeching calls, intermittent cries filled her ears. Her senses continued to reel, though the skies seemed empty. Yet the sounds of these birds had become intolerable. It rose in her ears, invading her senses and turning to a terrifying crescendo. She covered her ears with her hands and turned screaming. As she turned, the sounds followed her. She ran back to the direction of her room, and there they continued to follow. She ran through the strange and terrible place. Tears were running full stream down her face as she made a beeline for the bedroom door. It was a wonder this commotion had not woken the other 4 telepaths. Only she seemed aware of everything that was going on. She ran inside, slamming the door shut behind her and pressing her shoulder against it. It seemed rather a foolish and ineffective way to keep whatever it was from reaching her, but she continued enforcing all her weight against the door, determined to keep the terrors out. Bang! The door almost rebounded on her with the force of something trying to get in, but she remained determined. Bang! The door sprang back part way. More forcefully this time. She managed to force it shut again. She tried to bargain and plea with a thing that was trying to reach her. "Stop it, please! No!" she cried. She kept her hands pressed firmly against the door, trying to keep whatever it was back. "Stop it! Stop it!" she screamed. A minute had elapsed, maybe 2. The silence was frightful, carrying a feeling of caution. The door, likewise, remained still and motionless. Slowly and gradually, she began to take her full weight off the door, backing away from the still and silent portal. She knew that this was only a small, deliberate respite. Her heart was still thundering in her breast. She backed further away from the door. The silence, she discovered, was increasingly more fear-provoking than the noises, because now she was aware of the danger. She would expect its return at any given moment. Still shaking, Ramla turned her back to the door, and her breath instantly escaped her in a sharp panic. A large black crow was sitting now, perched upon her wooden headboard. It eyed her with those barren, featureless orbs, and fluttered its large sable feathers repeatedly. Ramla let out a sudden scream, or was she only dreaming the sound that filled her ears? Her companions were still asleep, unaware of what was happening. The crow suddenly took flight and came at her, beating those hideous big wings, which were like the colour of obsidian. She screamed again. Repeatedly she screamed, covering her face, her eyes with frantic hands. The creature was provoking her, forcing her to move onto the bed. She realized this, and still she could do nothing to prevent it. She collapsed, lashing out with her hands and feet. Her 4 other colleagues still did not awaken to the sounds of this riotous commotion. It was as though none of this was happening. It was as if everything she had perceived tonight had all taken flight in her dreams. The tiny clawed feet of this animal scratched and pulled at her tangled hair. "Get off! Get off!" she wailed desperately, her arms thrashing, flailing around, warding it off. Ramla's hair fell about her features as the creature flapped and picked at her with beak and talon, and then, rather unexpectedly, the attacks stopped. The aggressive cries had ceased. The crow's silence was sudden. The room was as still as the unspoken grave. Located in the town of Caprarola, the Farnese Palace remained the site of one of Italy's greatest cultural exhibitions, boasting an abundance of rich architecture and art. Take an imaginary stroll through these magnificent rooms. Take a saunter through time. The presence of these artists were felt everywhere. The walls literally breathed with the essence of their combined abilities. So many celebrated names resided here, as well as their muses. And if you took a further stroll through this architectural jewel, you would have noticed a lean figure standing alone. His name was Don Fermin. The muse, Don Fermin Diaz Tino de la Mata. His features manifested the worry he felt. He began to pace his small artist's workshop. "He's been here," he said, looking for all the world like a man who had seen a ghost. Who? Who has been here?" asked the treasurer with a look of concern. "Why, the one being on this entire planet we won't be able to overcome." "Oh." The man looked at Don Fermin as the realization came to him suddenly. "Oh my word, not him. Not him." Don Fermin looked his colleague in the eye. "The spider has awoken. His long slumber, buried in the tomb of ages, is finally over. We pulled at the filaments, tugged at the web. Now, this is the response we might have expected." "What are we going to do?" asked the treasurer. Don Fermin picked up his phone. "I'm calling for the council meeting immediately. We have to let the others know what is happening here." Thomas Clancy had sat all of that evening, sipping his glass of amaretto. His oldest daughter and son-in-law, as well as his delightful grandchild, Alessandra, had retired to bed hours ago. The garden was silent and still. He poured himself another drink and watched the night creatures fly and circle, flitting like tiny birds, darting back and forth. It was mildly entertaining for one who loved nature. Thomas Clancy was 64, but he was beginning to look a lot older. His eyes were starting to gradually sink, and his features were looking somewhat gaunt. Of course, this transformation had not gone without notice. He wondered how in hell he was going to keep his failing health a secret. They will find out the truth eventually, he thought to himself. 2 porch beacons allowed enough lighting to illuminate the grounds. Laurels, cypresses, mulberries, and a few orange trees afforded a picture most pleasing to the eye. He sat, his eyes growing progressively heavy. He began to nod to sleep. The garden was still and deathly quiet in the early twilight. A sharp and dreadful pain brought him back to the here and now. His eyes opened rapidly as he exhaled with a voluble breath. What is that? His mobile phone rang suddenly. Clancy lifted it out of his pocket and pressed the receive button. "Yes," he said, trying to put on a more positive face. He listened and then said, "All right, I'll be right over." Placing the phone back inside his pocket, he steadily rose from his seat. He had a feeling bad news would be waiting for him. Don Firmin heard the sound of the door groan behind him. He turned to see who had entered. Of course, he knew who it was. It was Thomas Clancy, the principal secretary of the Mythkey Institute. "Oh, Tom, am I relieved to see you. My dear boy, whatever is the matter? You sounded so desperate over the phone." "It's Ramla. Something attacked her last night." "Oh my God, she's not... She's in a coma." The old man brought his hand to his mouth quickly. "That poor child. What could have done this?" "What else? The spider," replied the muse. EVP was recorded on our equipment last night. Would seem to suggest the presence of the spider himself. Can't be ignored. It was mid-afternoon the next day when Robert Delisle arrived in Rome. A chauffeur was standing in the foyer of the airport waiting for him, just as Thomas Clancy had said. "Good afternoon, sir." The man spoke in Italian. "I have been instructed to take you to the Santo Spirito Ospedale." "The hospital?" Robert shot, his brows tightly knitted. "Yes, sir, right away. Mr. Clancy has requested it." There was a silver Audi waiting for him outside the airport. Robert watched as the chauffeur clicked a button on his key ring, and the door automatically unlocked. At the hospital, Clancy sat at Ramla's side, holding her hand. Young Ramla remained in a puppet-like trance. All Clancy could heed were the sounds that she made and the half-broken sentences that imparted nothing. Nevertheless, her mind was endeavouring to reach him telepathically. "Please, is there anyone who can hear me? Please. Anybody!" It was about 20 minutes to 5 when Robert entered the ward. Mr. Clancy rose from his chair as he entered. "Mr. Clancy, I came as fast as I could." Robert immediately stopped short. His eyes were suddenly gazing down at the young woman lying on the hospital bed. And he knew her. This was the girl who had come to him in New York in spirit, and had told him he was loved. She was there for me, back in New York when I needed a friend. I would just like to spend some time alone with her. Is that all right? "Take as much time as you need," said Thomas Clancy. "I will be outside the door with the security if you need me." Robert Delisle didn't reply. He just took the girl's hand in his. Maybe he reasoned, if he could just reach her with his mind, he could offer some encouragement.